Hello, Sarah. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Olivia.
Welcome to the Crown Tree Media Podcast. I am very excited to broach this subject with you this afternoon. Without further ado, quick intros. I'm Olivia Trentfo. I'll be your co-host today.
And I am Sarah Tranfo, and I will also be your co-host today.
Yeah, sisters. So, this is a topic that, frankly, I think I've been thinking about for the better part of a decade. And the topic we're going to be discussing is kind of a two-parter. It's the case for fantasy, or why fantasy is important, and then how to recommend fantasy to non-readers. And I think when I reflect on why this is an important topic and, like our personal connection, right? I think we're both in our family is largely kind of armchair experts in the fantasy realm. It's been near and dear to our hearts for our entire lives, really in the form of novels and kind of a lesser extent, movies and TV shows. But whenever I, tell my peers, right, like, what's your hobby? Oh, I read fantasy, like kind of solely. And they always side-eye me. And it's like, you what? Fantasy? Like Harry Potter, wizards and elves. And I get just within my peer group for a decade plus, right? I've always been given an immediate judgment for my love of this genre. Um, and I'm curious, like, if you've had similar experiences, like if you felt a little bit like
Oh,
off.
definitely, except
Yeah.
almost in the opposite direction. For me, it's whenever I tend to interact with people who maybe I consider particularly smart or intelligent or well-connected, I always feel like I have to couch my love of fantasy with, oh, but I also read literary fiction and I also read
Yeah.
nonfiction and I read mystery and I have, I read everything. And I almost feel like it's less intellectually rigorous or fulfilling if I say that I read a lot of fantasy or sci-fi novels instead of just, an absolute library of run-of-the-mill literary fiction. So it's almost like I understand where you're coming from if you interact with people who are not necessarily readers,
Yeah.
um, and who don't read a lot of books, but also from the other end of the spectrum, people who do read a lot or are very kind of plugged in and consider themselves intellectual. I always feel like I do have to almost um, dismiss my own love for the genre in order to be taken seriously.
Can you tell we have two different groups of peers? uh yeah, no, it definitely lowers your IQ in some people's perception, right? It's and I think the reason for that, the fantasy has this stigma around, and I think it maybe started in the 80s, at least for me, when I think about, our dad would maybe know this better, but like that Dungeons and Dragons era, right, of comic books and that nerd problem, right, of, oh, it's only, it's this kind of base level understanding of, what fantasy is,
I
that I
I
think really
totally
stigmatizes it.
agree. I think with the invention almost of the nerd archetype, which really didn't exist until like the 70s and 80s. If you think of
Yeah,
all of those classic
100%.
80s movies, The Revenge of the Nerds, St. Elmo's Fire, whatever, the kind of very stereotyping of the kind of nerdy guy. And then that was always kind of hand in hand with this love for fantasy, for Dungeons and Dragons, for that kind of media, that kind of pop culture was always seen as kind of super, super uncool, especially in that era. And that definitely carried over into our childhood for sure.
100%.
Because we're very much a product of, the mid to late 90s in terms of our kind of pop cultural consumption, also the mid 2000s. And it hasn't really been until quite recently, whatever you want to, whatever the reasons are, the kind of mainstreaming of comic books and other things, whether that was Game of Thrones, or which we'll get into, or the popularity of the Lord of the Rings movies, where that kind of perception has changed, but certainly through our father's adolescence, and I think our adolescence as well, fantasy was seen as the province of the nerds.
Yeah.
Like
So
fully.
I don't think I don't think those films, right? Lord of the Rings, you can even maybe put Harry Potter in there. I don't think it changed the perception of fantasy, because I think the perception actually still persists to this day. I think it made the barrier to entry more feasible for people. And I think that this is another problem fantasy suffers from. It's very daunting, right? You look at these books, they're the size of the Bible, right? They're minimum 600 pages. You can't find a good fantasy. They're also, 20 freaking plus books. Like this is a commitment. And a lot of the big, large population of the US they don't want to invest that much time. They're not big readers, right? Like this is a massive time investment you're typically making into these series, and that's a massive barrier to entry. I think it also suffers from, where I think films like The Lord of the Rings actually did such a service to this genre, in that it illustrated in a short format, okay, the payoff's going to be worth it. Like yes, it's a long commitment, but there's light at the end of the tunnel. And I think that's what some of these these adaptions have done.
I agree. I think you're spot on. I think that we have, not to get slightly political here, but we have never been less literate.
Oh, we're getting political. Oh,
okay. We as a country, we as a country have never been less literate than we are now. And I'm using literate as not just, okay, you can read, obviously. We all learn to read in school. I mean, a culture that we have never been a culture that reads less than we do now. And there's obviously myriad factors to that. The fact, whether you want to blame it on TikTok or YouTube or just
social media,
access of visual media these days has greatly, greatly, greatly diminished.
I don't know why there's balloons there. They just appeared. I'm not quite sure. My Zoom does this.
So there's obviously the easy access to all other sorts of entertainment. And I do think, part of that is also the diminishment of the American attention span. I mean, we can barely pay attention to like 10-second TikToks.
Right. That is, and it's so, it is, I think, directly correlated to the push of technology, social media, right? And we'll get into that, because Carl Jung does a really fascinating study around kind of the modern mind versus the more like antiquity mind, around just how, like, where the values of society were placed and how that has translated into, I think, what we're suffering from today, which is just, to your point, not a lot of people want to invest a serious amount of time into reading these kind of even classical literature, let alone fantasy novels. And I think where I want to really kind of gear this next part of the conversation is, okay, so these are all the problems fantasy has, right? The nerd problem, the barriers to entry, it's long, but it's so important. And I think that that's the message I want to stress. And I think it was so important to our development. It was so important to my adulthood. It was just such a formative genre for me in so many ways. And where I want to begin with the importance of this, I think, is with the most influential quote of this kind of study. And do you know what quote I'm going to bring up here?
Is it by G.K. Chesterton?
Yes. Do you know it off the top of your head?
I think I do. If I get it wrong, don't blame me. But I think it's fairy tale stories are more than true, not because they tell us that dragons are real, but because they tell us that dragons can be beaten. Did I get it?
You got it mostly.
Mostly. I paraphrased.
Fairy tales do not tell children dragons exist. Children already know the dragons exist. Fairy tales tell children the dragons can be killed. And I think the missing piece there was that this knowing that children have around dragons, evil, fear, right? Fairy tales and fantasy books don't introduce that into children's lives, into humans' lives. We already observe that within the world because it happens within the world, because it's there within the world, right? Any child has that intuition. What fantasy does and what these stories do is, Chesterton puts it, fairy tales, or you can synonymize it with fantasy. It appeals to that heroic archetype within all of us, that evil can be killed, that evil and pain and fear, right? Put whatever word you want in that, synonymized to dragons, can be defeated. And that, I think, is the overarching theme of this conversation is really going to come back to the fact that that inspirational kind of fantasy really captures and is a catalyst for taking that emotion and putting it into action.
And you have to understand also the context in which G.K. Chesterton was commentating. So he, like his peers, J.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, who we will also get to, existed in a world where, again, evil was incredibly real and an everyday occurrence. The evils of the turn of the century from World War I, especially G.K. Chesterton was British, so the horrors, especially of World War I, were at his doorstep. And then obviously moving into the horrors of Nazi Germany and the Axis powers, and then of World War II. So this was not some kind of dragon that was conceptual, or that, the dragon wasn't a mean dad or anything like that, or a bad teacher, which I think for a child can be a real dragon, but it was incredibly real. And these were children in Great Britain and in other parts of the world, especially in Europe, that were experiencing real evil on a daily basis. And this was the context in which a lot of kind of the foundations of fantasy, especially in the English-speaking world, were developed, was in this cultural context, which I think is so important because, the horrors of modern warfare and the death that it wrought kind of needed that almost fantastical hero to fight it off. And I do think that, it wasn't just written in a vacuum. I think the actual historical foundations of this genre need to come into account for sure.
100%. And I'm so happy you brought that up, because this is why I think, so bringing it back a little bit to, this is, I promise, my last time bringing up Harry Potter, but I think Harry Potter is important because I think it was, right, you had Lord of the Rings, and then you kind of have this in kind of dwindle. Yeah, you have Wheel of Time and certain other things, but Harry Potter was really, I think, the next large formative thing, right, that
100%.
brought fantasy back into the public forum. And I think this is why Harry Potter really, one of the reasons Harry Potter appealed to the masses was that there is no moral ambiguity of Voldemort's evil, right? You have this big bad, and then you have this child, Harry, who overcomes that demon time and time again. And as I mentioned earlier, right, around with this quote, when you're young, we know fear, we know evil, we know wrong. Like, these are very black and white emotions that we feel full-heartedly. Where as we get older, particularly in these modern times, that conviction dwindled. It dwindled for me with, you can kind of correlate this to the loss of religion, right? And the dwindling of religion. And there's this moral ambiguity we all live in. And for me, particularly, like, I remember in my 20s, you kind of discover this quote or this theme of life happens in the gray. Like, most of life happens in the gray, and it does. And I'm not saying
True.
that life is all black and white. And I agree that most life happens in the gray. But what I went through was a period of my time where I really leaned into that too much. And I think in these modern times, people lean into that gray so much. And I think
everything is relative.
Yes. And for me, and because you're having this cognitive dissonance here where, right, everything's relative, the world happens in gray, but yet evil and fear and pain does persist in the real world every day. It doesn't discriminate. You feel it regardless of your race, of your ethnicity, of your age. It exists. It's part of life. And for me, what fantasy did was it painted a face and a name to that evil. It first let me acknowledge that, oh, wow, so there is evil in this world and there is that pain. And then it did the most amazing thing where it not only it allowed me to acknowledge that, it then provided me the tools to overcome it. And I think that is why fantasy is so important, arguably now more than ever, because we don't have religion, right, as that lens through which we can see, right, these right and wrongs, that moral guidance. For me, that's the function fantasy has served so much in my life, is to really identify that evil and then provide me the tools to overcome it.
I completely agree. And it's one of the reasons why I actually prefer much more modern fantasy writing and classic fantasy writing to kind of the modern inclination, the kind of more decadent, self-indulgent, narcissistic musings of modern literature, which tends to be so focused on the self, on self-betterment, on loving oneself, on it's so self-focused, it's so internally focused, it is so, for lack of a better word, selfish, narcissistic, whatever word you want to use. And to me, it never rang as powerful or as true as something like fantasy does. I think fantasy can speak to more universal truths. I think fantasy can speak to more actual truths instead of your truth or my truth. I think fantasy can actually speak the truth. And that's a concept I think that has been pretty much ripped from a lot of modern media in this kind of postmodern moment we are living in. And at least for me, that's why fantasy tends to resonate, because it tends to have more classical ideals, more classical archetypes, which I think is what, it's what human storytelling for hundreds of years has been surrounded by. And it's certainly what I prefer. It's certainly what I think is much more valuable, culturally speaking, than a lot of what we are seeing in modern literature, modern films, modern television, take your pick. So, yeah.
So who would agree with you on that sentiment is Carl Jung, a very famous psychologist who studied the
Better
art.
than Freud.
Way better than Freud. And his sole purpose on this planet was to study the art of how you can make the unconscious conscious. And he is known for his analysis on myths and archetypes. And what is fantasy? Fantasy are myth stories. Fantasy are fairy stories. And Carl Jung really leaned into this idea around archetypes. And one of, my favorite quotes is, or the way he thinks about archetypes within stories are, archetypes are the fingerprints of the unconscious. And there's many different types of archetypes. And you could have, the lover, the explorer, the hero, the trickster, etc. But what he observes is throughout every religion around the world, throughout all the different time periods, you can study them, and as he did, they all have the same core archetypes. And for him, this was the kind of the evidence and the cornerstone of his studies to say, hey, there's something here, right? There's something universal to your point that is going on that you can kind of pinpoint, right? This god of water in the Greek times to this, god in Japan, right? A whole world apart 5,000 years ago. And, the Greek word for this is, he called these archetypes and these powers of myth the breath of life. And that these stories and archetypes were the crucial and were the catalyst to connecting the unconscious to the conscious mind. And it was very much, right, kind of the way to activate the unconscious was through these stories. And to me, like from a analytical scientific evidence, like you can't get, I think, more detailed than if you study Carl Jung around this type of the importance of it, right, through civilization and how we learn, and right, myth as a way of thinking. I think there's just the evidence is is sprawling. And we were talking about this before we hopped on here, but when we look at kind of, I think the, you know, the human, modern civilization, right, where so much of our focus lies is through technology, is through logical thinking, is through, you know, building things better, faster, stronger. We live in a technological world. We live in a very modern world that values, right, those types of outcomes and outputs. Where the majority of this is actually a very new way of thinking. Through the majority of human history, what they valued was actually fantasy-like thinking, creative thinking. So much of their time was built into, you know, creating these stories, creating these kind of religious structures. And I think the perfect example of this is how all of these modern and ancient civilizations, you know, today we're governed by, at least in America, where we have our Constitution. We have, you know, our Declaration of Independence. Back then, everything that governed, you know, ancient society were their stories, was their myths, was their religion, right? And that was a cornerstone of society back then. And I think we've lost a little bit of we've lost something where that has been fully removed from our culture.
I agree. I think that, and you could see how it evolved, right? I think if you think of pre-Christendom, so pre-Christianity, you see a lot of kind of pantheonic myths. So whether that was the Greeks or the Romans or the Egyptians. And then when Catholicism became, as you know, started covering a lot of the Western world and even North Africa and into the Middle East, you started to see, I don't want to necessarily call them a pantheon, but the host of saints was incredibly important to early Christianity or Catholicism, whatever you want to call it. And kind of those saints, you had Saint Francis who guarded over animals, and you had Saint Teresa who guarded over the children, and you had Saint Anthony, the saint of lost things. And they almost functioned, you know, society as you prayed to certain saints if you lost something or if you needed intercession for a disease. And so they had a similar societal function to like the pantheonic gods. And, you know, I've seen definitely a lot of, as we secularize, especially in the West, what has replaced the saints or the gods in society. And I think
Stadiums.
We had been, what did you say?
Football stadiums?
Well, not just, okay, good, you're on the right track. But I think if we had had this talk like 10 years ago, it would have been the Marvel superheroes.
Yeah.
Or like like you had Captain America and Iron Man. They kind of were kind of archetypes, but they definitely represented they were kind of like saints. I mean, if you look at how much money Marvel made during its last decade before, you know, it hit this downturn that it currently is on now, you know, certainly we as a society worshipped them, I think, in a way. And so I do think what heroes we as a society choose to worship speak to what our values are of right now. And I do think that we are inclined towards that kind of behavior as humans. Like, even if you get rid of Christianity, it's going to be replaced by something. True
fantasy.
Atheism.
That's why we need fantasy.
Yeah, I completely agree, because it should be replaced with something that I think is a net good. I don't necessarily think Americans and everyone in the world kind of falling all over themselves for the next Marvel movie, you know, fully guilty, was super healthy for society. I don't know that it was. I think we should look to better gods, better heroes, better monsters,
better stories, right? And I think that that's the stories that teach us universal truths about our unconscious. And that is, to me, what fantasy does. And then
Young was right.
Young was right. Because and here's like, so this is what he says, right? He says, myth works when it grabs one emotionally. Consciously, one may be stirred by the feats of a hero, but unconsciously, it's the heroic side of one's personality being aroused. And to me, right, that speaks to the universality of these themes. All right, we're gonna quickly now move on to how to recommend fantasy to non-fantasy readers.
Yes. So that's me. So I actually split. Oh, I could start. Or do you want to start?
Yeah, well, I'm gonna quickly like talk through maybe some like pitfalls I've experienced with some recommendations around like where what hasn't worked.
Go for it.
Um, so I've typically always started with Name of the Wind as your first entree into fantasy. And I have a 50% success rate. Sometimes it works and hooks them to other, taking kind of a deeper dive into more fantasy epics with more points of views, with more deeper scope.
By the way, this is The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss.
Yes. Other half of the time it flops because it isn't exactly it's not Name of the Wind doesn't hold too many, I would say, similarities with the larger kind of ecosystem of the genre. Do you agree or disagree?
I totally agree. There is and
Well,
I
and
say
why?
this,
Why, like, why do you think that?
okay. I say this with genuine affection for the book. I love it.
I love it.
It
Don't like the
it
author.
is very pretentious. And I mean that in almost in a
Totally
positive
is.
almost in a positive way, right? I think that Rothfuss is maybe big comment from me, but I think he's the best prose writer in modern fantasy if he ever decides to write again.
Agreed.
His prose is stunning. It is beautiful, it is lyrical, it's poetic, it's whatever adjective you want.
It was the
here.
speech in my wedding was by Patrick
Yes,
Rothfuss.
it sure
The
was.
wedding reading.
It sure
Love him.
was. I think that he can tell a goddamn story, and he can tell it beautifully, and it will tug at that place in your soul or in your heart that kind of understands the power of story. And I think that he can turn a fucking phrase. Excuse my French. The problem, I think, with Name of the Wind is that I think nearly everything else is not as strong. I don't think he's great at character work. I don't necessarily think he's phenomenal at plotting. I think his plots are fine. And I think and we'll talk about this later because it's going to be a point for me. I think he's really bad at romance. I think he's great at friendship. I think he's phenomenal at friendship. I think he's really bad at romance. And so I do think that there are a lot of very obvious pitfalls in his writing. And I think if you are someone that just loves to read good writing, even if you haven't been exposed to a lot of fantasy before, you're probably going to love The Name of the Wind.
Yeah.
But it is very unique. And there is not a lot of stuff out there like it. And it's not what I prefer to read when it comes to fantasy. If I want to read something like that, I'll just read poetry, honestly.
Yeah, such a good point. So how do you then recommend? I haven't seen your list. So before this, I told Sarah to put together a list of books to recommend to non-fantasy readers. Let's dive into it.
So I split this into a couple different categories because I think recommendations, what people don't understand is I would be recommending something to a specific person. I would know that person. I would know their prior interests. I would know what they like. So I would never recommend, for example, grimdark fantasy to my mother. That would not be a recommendation to her. But in a similar vein, and this is where I'm going to start, I'm going to recommend this book to a person in your life if they love rom-coms, if they love romance, if they, have just finished watching Bridgerton, or they are obsessed with, take your pick, When Harry Met Sally, Four Weddings and a Funeral, those kind of stories. And I think that increasingly we are a culture that is devoid of romance. we are, you know, I think very honestly, we're a bit of an oversexed culture. And I think that a lot of our modern media has kind of removed romance, and almost from both directions. I think if you read or if you interact with a lot of modern feminist media, there is this sense that a woman falling in love is almost anti-feminist. You can see this very evidently with like modern Disney movies. Where are the princes? A modern Disney hero doesn't, a modern Disney heroine doesn't fall in love. She doesn't have a prince. She's a strong, independent woman and she doesn't need no man. Hello? When I was little, I was obsessed with love stories. I loved that Belle got together with the Beast.
I
and
have
that
no idea where
Aladdin
you're
got
going to go with
together with
this, by the way.
Jasmine. Like, that was absolutely a huge part of why I loved all the Renaissance era Disney movies, was the
Yeah.
romance, was the cute romance.
100%.
And that has been like stripped from a lot of kind of modern fairy tales and stories. And I think that's why you're seeing shows like Bridgerton like absolutely explode in popularity. So, with all that being said, the book I'm going to recommend is going to be by an author, Brandon Sanderson, who, may I add, one of the reasons I'm going to recommend this for beginner fantasy readers is that he has some of the easiest to read prose in the genre, maybe the easiest to read prose. You are not going to go to Brandon Sanderson for poetry, but you're going to go to him to absolutely be sucked in to a world with amazing characters, great plotting, and it is just going to wash over you, and you will find yourself unable to stop flipping those pages. So, and the book I'm going to recommend is a standalone book, another rarity in modern fantasy, and it's called Warbreaker. And I love this book because it took me completely by surprise. As someone who has a couple of sisters, this is some of the best sibling and particular sister characters who have an incredibly believable sister relationship. And it absolutely kind of grabbed me by the neck. And I was like, I recognize myself in this kind of relationship. It felt true, it felt real, but it also has at its heart some of the cutest romance in the fantasy genre. A romance that will absolutely surprise you and will grab your heart. And I think that, again, it doesn't have that overly sexed nature that I think a lot of like modern romance books also have.
It's also
like,
not prude.
It's also not prude, correct.
Yeah,
it's not prude, but it's not, there's no smut here. I mean, if
no,
we'll get to it, I'm going to recommend something that does have smut later on.
What's smut? I've heard this is like the second. Oh,
sex scenes.
Okay.
How do you not know what smut means?
Because
How are
I
you?
refuse to read whatever that book is that everyone's.
Oh, we'll get to it because that's going to be on my recommendations, by the way.
Oh God.
Oh, just wait. So once again, the book is Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. And
take notes, people. Take
notes. I do think that, again, similar to like, let's say Frozen, it has such a great sister relationship, but it also has romance. And it also has, like I said, it has humor, which I think is so important. Like I said, I grew up on rom-coms. You grew up on rom-coms.
Yeah.
I love the humor in it, the genuine humor. And that I think is also kind of rare for a lot of modern fantasy.
I think I need to reread this book. Oh my God. I'm like,
you need to reread it. It's so good.
I loved it. I loved it. I know
it's not that long.
It's
a
not
complete
long.
standalone. It's one story.
No, I'm saying I loved it. You're just like making me fall in love with it again.
Yeah,
like you're right.
So
it's
great.
so good. It's such
so great.
Oh, that's such a good recommendation, Sarah. That's spot on. Spot on.
Thank you. I did my homework. I came prepared.
Wow, you really did.
Okay, so the next thing I'm going to recommend is, I actually would say that there is a surprising amount of people, you know this, that adults, by the way, that have never read Harry Potter. I'm not going to recommend Harry Potter, but stay with me here. That have only grown up like watching the movies. And I think that was shocking to me when I,
Mm.
after I graduated high school and I started meeting people in college and at work,
Yeah.
that they like knew Harry Potter things that had never actually read the books, which is like shocking to me. But I do think that if you are meeting someone who's open to the fantasy genre and kind of all that they'd encountered so far is Harry Potter,
Movies.
the movies.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say number one, just tell them to read the books.
Yeah.
But the stories that I would actually tell them to read is by an author named Michael J. Sullivan. So he has a great story. He started his books off by self-publishing them. And this story started off as a story he wrote for his young daughter, which, if you know anything about Tolkien, that's how The Hobbit was born. The Hobbit was originally written as a story that Tolkien would tell his sons. So I think that is, he learned from the best, Michael J. Sullivan. And this series of books is called the first trio of books is called the Rhyria Revelations. It's difficult. I have a bit of a speech impediment, so it's difficult for me to say. But the first of those is called The Theft of Swords. And this series of books, Olivia actually hasn't read these.
I haven't read them.
I recommended them to her last week. These stories are incredibly charming and written in a way that, again, is not going to be difficult to read. There is not 1 million characters. There are not so many fantasy terms that you're going to need to know. This is an incredibly straightforward, classic fantasy world. There are elves and there are humans. There are kings and princes and princesses, and there are rogues. And how the story is started is we follow two best friends who are kind of rogues. They take contracts and they steal things for money. And from there, of course, the story gets much bigger and they kind of find themselves amongst a story that's much, much bigger than they are. Or is it? And it's just some of the most charming and funny and honest and great storytelling. And I do think that is a bit of a rarity, especially among modern fantasy. I always tell people that go into reading Theft of Swords, it's a throwback. It is a total throwback. It is not burdened by a lot of the more self-indulgent things that I think modern fantasy tends to do, the kind of, I need all of the representation. I need the strong female character. I need this to be incredibly diverse.
We love it. We love a good, strong female character.
We do, but like, we don't need her only attribute to be that she's like badass.
Right.
Like, we don't need the fact, like
we need her to lean into her femininity. We need her to lean into her emotions. We need her to, we need her
to be a human being.
Yes.
Like, we need her to be a human being that has like a well-rounded personality. We don't just her badass sword.
Yeah. How is this author writing female characters?
Totally. I mean, look, he's writing them like he writes his male characters, which is there is no pretension. There is no kind of weirdly feelings of guilt that I need to make her so much better than everyone else, or else I'm not being like a feminist. There's no, it's just this classic fun fantasy that really is totally unburdened. And I find a lot of modern fantasy very burdened by this cultural moment that we live in, even from some of my favorite authors, who I think do great work. Do we need look?
Well, okay, you don't have to.
I don't want to go into it because
you don't have to go into it. This is not. We're not discussing, the problems of modern fantasy.
But I do think that one of the reasons I do love, and the first book is called The Theft of Swords, is it's just free. It is fun. It is. You can tell he wrote this for an audience of one, and that makes it better. It was like I wrote this for my daughter. I wanted her to have something fun to read before she.
I'm so excited to read it. That's once I finish the Pierce Brown's new book, I might pick up that series.
So highly recommended for me. It's great it is absolutely fantastic for beginners. Like I said, there's not.
Would it also be fantastic for non-beginners?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I read it and loved it, and
basically the farthest you can get from a fantasy beginner
Yeah,
as
right.
exists.
Yeah.
So, and again, like I said, a total throwback and just a fun time reading. So that
How
would be
are
my-
the pretty straightforward world building and naming conventions?
Exactly. You are not going
Okay.
to have to learn another language. You're not
Lovely.
going to
Love
sit
it.
there trying to think, how do I pronounce this out loud? You
Yeah.
are not going to have to, memorize, like I said, 1 million characters and 1 million, like, where are we on the map? Like,
Yeah,
where is
yeah, yeah,
this?
yeah. Okay,
How
great.
many
Yeah.
years of history do I need to know? Yeah. Although, I'm someone who likes that, but for beginners.
For beginners. Yeah. Love it.
All right. So my third recommendation. So this is going to be for a different kind of person. This is going to be for someone who is maybe, I don't want to, stereotype them as like a dude, but like someone
Masculine.
masculine, someone who has probably seen Game of Thrones and probably likes some of the more martial aspects of fantasy and likes a good fight scene, likes a good battle, likes the kind of more down and dirty aspects of fantasy. And I think you might be surprised, Olivia, that I'm recommending these to beginners, but I think its growing popularity in the genre speaks to its potential universality. And I think, like, I see this as getting more popular every year, especially since I read it. So I'm actually going to be recommending Joe Abercrombie's The Blade itself.
Wow. Hot take.
So that's
I
the
don't know
first
if
Law
I.
trilogy. So
Wow.
the reason I'm going to be recommending this is because I've actually gotten like a couple of guys into fantasy through this book. This book
Wow.
is brutal.
Really?
Yes, 100%. I do think almost, and I don't know why, especially considering what we talked about in the 80s, how a lot of the fantasy had a very like male nerd,
Yeah.
like
Stigma.
I do think a lot of modern fantasy is very female skewing. I don't know why, but I do think it's a genre that tends to have more female fans than male fans. I don't know why. That's just my impression. That's kind of what I've seen.
Okay.
And I do think that for guys that have kind of have grown up with Call of Duty video games and very blatant violence all the time everywhere, I do think that they expect maybe a certain level of honest brutality in fantasy. And I think that that's a totally fair expectation to have, especially if a fantasy story is going to have anything to do with war or fighting or anything like that. I think maybe being honest about the actual brutality of a world like that is super valuable. And if there's any modern fantasy book series that does it well, it's the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie.
Okay. I'm gonna disagree with you on this sentiment.
Okay.
If we're taking this demographic, right? This masculine person who grew up with first person shooter games as our person we're recommending books to. I hesitate with the First Law because grimdark is, I would say, a subgenre of fantasy. Like it's not
yes, totally.
It's not it's not classical fantasy. So I think it's a different genre. And I think it does as a different genre. I do think it lacks some of the, I think, important maybe
I disagree.
Themes. Okay, you disagree. Well,
I do think, look, as someone who did, just deride a lot of postmodernism, I do think First Law is quite postmodern. I agree. But in a way I think it's postmodern in a way that Game of Thrones isn't. Game of Thrones, I think, is the absolute archetype of postmodern fantasy. Game of Thrones was written, and George R. R. Martin has explicitly stated that he wrote Game of Thrones in order to invert the kind of classical fantasy tropes that the genre is built on, from Tolkien to Lewis to Robert Jordan. He wrote Game of Thrones as an exercise in that inversion, in that trope inversion. I think that First Law is a little bit more honest. And look, I genuinely love Game of Thrones, and I do think that you know,
Okay,
the
can I
ubiquity-
wait, pause. I need to push back. Would you use, I'm pushing back on the word honest. I would maybe can we change that word to maybe self-aware?
self-aware, maybe self-aware.
Because
That's fine.
yeah, I don't think like Game of Thrones is pretty freaking honest. Like in terms of
True.
what it just presents. Yeah,
Okay.
I think
Yes.
self-aware is the more appropriate word.
Okay. We can use self-aware. I think that, look, but I love Game of Thrones, and actually I think its ubiquity, so the millions and millions upon millions of people who have seen the
Yeah.
show, I think makes it difficult for me to recommend the books to someone, because I think it's difficult to recommend books to about a story that everyone already knows, even though the
Yeah.
books are different from the show, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think that that's actually difficult. So this is why mostly I
yeah.
chose First Law,
Fair.
because it's, I think that, again, I maybe hot take, I prefer Game of Thrones to First Law. I like Game of Thrones
Same.
better than First Law.
Same.
Better character work. I think George R. R. Martin is a better
Agreed.
writer. So all of
Agreed.
that being said,
Agreed.
I do think, though, that there is an appeal to First Law for someone who isn't me. And I've seen that appeal in a lot of the guys
Men.
in my
What
life.
about, okay, so this might be controversial because I never know what genre this falls into, but I already mentioned Pierce Brown, like Red Rising. Is this what does Red Rising fall into the fantasy genre?
No, it's almost entirely science fiction. And it's because I would say
Okay.
that something like Star Wars definitely falls into to the science fantasy genre. Like
Okay.
Star Wars is fantasy to me. I think that Red Rising is a pure science fiction novel.
Okay, then I think you're right in terms of kind of the gruesome aspect. There's really, because I'm trying to rack my brain around another fantasy I've read that more like classical fantasy that really leans into that kind of violence aspect.
I mean, unless you're going to recommend Gene Wolfe, which I am
Yeah.
not, because it's
No.
supposed to be recommends for people
No.
who are beginners in fantasy,
No,
not
this is
someone who is
beginners.
advanced. So I do think that you can read The Blade itself, which is the first book,
Yeah.
if you're a novice to fantasy. I think that it's written in a way
Yeah.
that is approachable. And I do think one of the reasons I'm recommending this is the characters are so good.
Yeah.
I think that
You're so
Glokta,
right. You're so right.
Glokta is like up there with, and I'm going to maybe go into things you don't know. Glokta's up there with like the Master Chiefs and the Kratoses of the world. So those are the main characters of popular video games. Like I do think he's almost like a video game protagonist to me.
Yeah.
Like he is so memorable. He's based. He's fucking awesome. You know, he's all of those things that I think make a kind of really awesome male character. And I've seen like so many guys respond to him and respond to the writing in general.
Yeah, now that I think about this more, it is really kind of a watered down Game of Thrones in some ways, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not as ambitious.
No.
It's way more of a tight story. It's way smaller in scope. It's definitely telling a bit of a smaller story. I mean, even Logan Nine Fingers, like,
oh, he's my favorite.
Yeah, well, he's
like
my favorite too, but he's like, I feel like he has more appeal to women, and then there's Glokta, which every guy is obsessed with. Like, okay. But yeah, I just think that, again, I would not recommend Warbreaker to the same person I'm recommending The Blade itself to.
100%. Wow, I feel like you've made me rethink my whole strategy. And you know what? I love that the name of the one doesn't fall into any of those.
No. Okay, I'm gonna turn my light on because holy crap, I forgot that the sun sets so early. Give me 1 sec.
You know, now we got to see your pretty background when you got up.
background I set up that you can't even see unless I'm standing up. Okay.
Yeah. Oh,
So
all right. I
have
love it.
my-
Oh, you have
I have-
another one.
Well, I have 5. Didn't you tell me
Oh,
to do
wow.
5?
No, I don't remember what I said. Okay. We're on. We're moving through this.
Okay, so I said I was going to bring it up, and I have to just because
I feel like I have to acknowledge a reality in modern fantasy. And that reality is that fantasy romance this year, in the year of our Lord 2023, has become the most read genre
Oh my gosh.
online, which is like,
I can't
okay,
believe you're bringing this up.
I have to. And
Okay.
this is going to be by far my most tepid recommendation. I don't really want to make this recommendation, but I do feel like this is less a recommendation and more an acknowledgement of reality.
Okay, so say the name of the thing.
So it's The Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah
Okay.
J. Maas.
Okay. And who are you recommending this to?
I'm recommending this to middle-aged women who love
Oh.
50 Shades of Grey, aka our mother.
Has she read it, our mother?
No, she hasn't. I told her not to.
Yeah. Well,
But
okay, so
okay, so this is the.
So then you're not recommending
I've
this.
gone around. This is so really what I want to talk about. This is my to acknowledge that I actually have my own pretentious biases, and I think that like how I
Fair.
view some of these readers is how a lot of other people view me as a reader, and so I want to acknowledge that's bad and that there is some merit here, something that is valuable.
You're so evolved.
I know, and that's, I'm 30 now,
Wow.
so I'm growing and I'm learning. But just like quick story time, my mother got recommended this book earlier this year by a friend, and I was embarrassed. I was like, "You are not reading this. This is stupid." And then a couple months later, she got recommended another book, and I recognized that the state of this genre is in such bad shape that actually A Court of Thorns and Roses is basically high art in comparison. And
Okay.
if you just give me a chance, like crap all over some of the most popular books right now, like Fourth Wing, which is barely better, not even, it's worse than a lot of like fan fiction level writing.
Okay.
So that being said, I think that A Court of Thorns and Roses, and specifically the second book in the series, A Court of Mists and Fury, actually has merit as a romance novel set in a fantasy type setting. So I think if you enjoyed 50 Shades of Grey, if you enjoyed Outlander, if you enjoyed some of the more fantastical romances that have gotten really popular in the 21st century, and you want to kind of dip your toe a little bit into more fantasy, I do think a really good bridge to that is this series, A Court of Thorns and Roses. And just in case you've been living under a rock, so this series is a very loose retelling of, at least the first book, a very, very loose retelling of The Beauty and the Beast set in a fairy world, so set among the Fae court. So it actually does explore a type of fantasy or fairy story that is explicit in its fairies, and it's actually a genre that obviously has been growing in popularity, but that I didn't really read a lot growing up. I didn't read a lot of actually like explicit
romance
fae stories.
Oh, fae stories.
Like fae, like the Winter Court and the Summer Court.
Yeah.
Very kind of traditional fairy stories.
Yeah.
And this is set in that kind of a world. Our main character is human, and she gets kidnapped into the fairy world. Again, think Beauty and the Beast. And she kind of has to survive. And she meets a lot of characters along the way. And there is sex to be had.
Amongst the fairies.
Amongst the fairies.
Can I ask a really dumb question? You
Yes.
can tell, obviously I haven't read this book. Are we talking like, are fairies small?
No. So these are like, they're beautiful, and they're 6 feet tall, and they're, think
They're
of
elves.
Twilight vampires.
I'm thinking elves.
No, 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 no. I mean, they do have pointy ears, so they are way more similar
How
to
are
like
they not like
Tolkien
Tolkien
elves.
elves?
Yeah, they're basically
Okay.
Tolkien elves, except they're called fairies, and they have, but they have a very specific culture that's a little bit different. They're way more like sex crazed, and they're way more trickstery, and they're a little bit more devious and morally gray.
Yeah. So the way you framed it to me when we spoke about this like weeks ago, it's like this is a romance story with fantasy themes. Like
Totally. This is
it's a romance,
first.
genre. It's a romance genre. Yeah.
Yes, it's a romance first, and also there is this. I mean, there is explicit sex scenes in here, so
Which is not common in the fantasy genre. Like that's not a
no, but it is actually becoming more common, especially as these books gain unbelievable popularity online, especially among the book talk community.
yeah, wow. I have
So,
thoughts
and I
on
do
that,
think,
but
I honestly think that this is the best of them, especially the second book, A Court of Mist and Fury, which I thought was delightful. I will say
wow.
it.
Well,
I
maybe
actually
I'll pick it
enjoyed
up.
a Sarah J. Maas book. I actually did. I do not think that she's the Shakespeare of our time. I don't think she is
How would
that
you
good.
compare her to Stephanie Meyer?
Similar levels.
Okay, similar levels. Great. There you have it. Maybe
can
maybe I won't. I don't know if I'll ever really be in the mood to crave a romance novel, but you never know. Maybe I will. It's not something
I think that yeah, it's I don't think it goes so far as like erotica, but I actually do think that if you're like a girl, I do think that you can have like a really fun time reading some of this stuff.
Love it.
Like if you don't want to watch When Harry Met Sally or even some of the more like straightforward romance movies,
Yeah.
pick up one of these
Listen,
books.
if it gets people reading, if it gets people to pick up a book, like we're here for it. We support it. We love it. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Fifth and final, Sarah.
Fifth and final, this is going to be a cliche. You can probably guess what it is, but this is going to be my recommendation for the most general recommendation. Someone who's like, if you've never read fantasy before, or you've only read Harry Potter, this is the book, and you're older than 15. And you're kind of dipping your toe into the genre for the first time. The most and biggest crowd pleaser of a story, the one that I think hits the classic and best tropes, the one that is just so enjoyable and that you can read without any caveats. And this is, of course, Mistborn, the Mistborn trilogy.
Yay!
Like I have had
Mistborn by Brandon
Sanderson. This has been the highest degree of success that I've had in recommending fantasy to beginners by far. This is batting 800, right? And I think that this is for a couple of different reasons. Number one, this has one of the best tropes ever. So if you like Ocean's 11 or The Dirty Dozen, this has, we're getting the gang together to pull off a heist, kind of a plot. That's what the plot of this is. Sprinkled in there's some cool romance, there's some intrigue, there's a ton of mystery, but at its core, this is we're getting the gang together movie or book. Sorry, it's not a movie yet. At its core, that's what this story is. And I do think that the advantages that Sanderson has with his writing are, number one, I think he's a master at character. There are a couple characters in here that I put on Mount Rushmore. One character in particular that I put on Mount Rushmore in terms of my favorite fantasy characters. This has, I think, also on the Mount Rushmore of magic systems, world building, something we haven't really touched on a whole lot, because I do think for beginners, too complex world building is not
Agreed.
But this has some really kick-ass magic systems and world building, one that is not too complicated, but is also, I think, complex enough to really kind of awaken like fantasy for people. Like this is what the genre could be for them. And then I also think it has a really approachable main character who is the exact opposite of insufferable. She is, I think she's exactly what I'm looking for when I read a young female protagonist. She feels incredibly authentic and real to me as a woman, especially when I was a young woman, when I read Mistborn for the first time. She did not feel like overly fake or overly powered, or there wasn't like too much girl power. There wasn't really girl power at all. She felt like the classic hero tropes of my childhood, whether that was Harry Potter or Frodo Baggins, except she happened to be a girl. And I mean, that was catnip. It was absolute catnip to me. And I do think that it is a succinct trilogy. It really has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's not a million books that you have to invest into unless you want to. And it's just some of the best storytelling that's exists past the year 2000.
You said it, you said everything. And I think what's important to note is that with all these books you just listed, these are either standalones or finished, completed trilogies.
Yes.
So important.
Yes. You're not going to be waiting a million years.
No.
For the next book to come out.
And another thing interesting to note with all your recommendations, 4 out of 5 are female lead characters.
True.
Yeah.
True.
Yeah. Huh?
Very true. I don't.
I think they're all, again, I think that's maybe like a misnomer around fantasy is all, you know, they're really bad at writing females. I disagree.
Oh, that's
like
so wrong.
So wrong.
A
like,
lot, by the way, a lot of female protagonists, but only one female author.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Which I think it flies in the face of a lot of kind of, you know, modern, or not modern, but a lot of, you know, some modern commentary, I guess, will say that, oh, men don't know how to write women. No, of course they do.
Of course they do. And of course, women can write men.
Exactly.
But it depends on the skill of the writer. Like,
great. It's totally
skill of the writer. Agreed. All right. Sarah, thank you for your recommendations. I've learned so much and I appreciate you.
I appreciate you too, Olivia.
Yay. Signing off for the Case for Fantasy and How to Recommend for Non-Fantasy Readers.
Bye, guys.